Hello, everyone. Welcome to our CIO boardroom. My name is Matt Murdoch, and I'm here with George Rhodes. We're going to spend the next hour talking about a real-world cloud security assessment and how we could take you from gaps to governance. George, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Matt said, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's session is really about one core idea. How organizations move from having security gaps to having real governance and control over their environment. So, most of the organizations we work with already have the right tools, the right investments, and the right intentions, but they still struggle to clearly answer where they're actually exposed and what matters most, and how to confidently communicate that risk to leadership. So what we're going to walk through today is a practical, real-world approach to solving that. So how you go from fragmented visibility to a defensible, board-ready security posture using a structured cloud security assessment that goes across identity, cloud, and endpoints.
Yeah. Thanks, George. The goal here is to remain very grounded in reality. We know that there's no such thing as unlimited time and unlimited resources. So the goal here is to talk about real world client environments that we've worked within, and then hopefully leave you with some actions that you could take after the fact.
Absolutely. Yeah, so just a quick introduction. My background is in security architecture and incident response, and today I serve as a vCISO, working directly with organizations to assess risk and help leadership teams understand their security posture in practical, real-world terms. That's key and important. Between Matt and I, we've worked across a wide range of environments, helping organizations move from simply implementing security controls to actually having visibility, alignment, and governance across those controls.
Yeah, Matt Murdoch, I lead the cybersecurity practice here at Synoptek. We split our services really into two main buckets. Folks like George on the security consulting side, so thinking about the people and the process side of security. And then we also have 24/7 security operations. So you could think outsourced SOC, vulnerability management, training and awareness. We help our clients that have completely outsourced their IT security to us, as well as companies that have their own CIOs and CISOs. And there we're that IT executive's right hand, helping them to secure their posture and then building out board of director ready deliverables in order to not only strengthen their environment, but properly communicate that strength.
Yeah. So, here's how we'll structure today's conversation. We'll start by grounding things in the current landscape. So what's actually happening across organizations and where we consistently see gaps emerge. And then from there, we'll walk through where those gaps typically exist in real environments. And it's going to be across identity, cloud platforms like Azure and endpoints. And really why they're often not as visible as they seem. And then we'll shift into how you move from that state into something more structured, how you build a defensible security baseline, and really more importantly, how you prioritize what actually matters from a risk perspective.
All right. Okay. So, cybersecurity improvements that could be made today. If we simplify all things security down to as few points as possible, what's on your screen right now are the security factors or lack thereof that almost 100% are come up in any root cause analysis that we see when any of our clients or in the headlines there's a security event. So in no particular order, the non-negotiable essentials of every security program have one, likely two gaps in the following four. Enforcing MFA across the environment. This is no longer a nice to have. This should not be done just for cybersecurity insurance reasons. This is a non-negotiable. The sophisticated attacks often start with some weakness in a very basic form of technology, and that involves a lack of MFA deployment. The other side of that, the other weakest link in the chain is the people, your employees, your vendors, your contractors and consultants. Implementing security training and awareness. To quote the often used saying here, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Humans absolutely are the weakest link. You could see how the first two things mentioned here, when you have a weak security culture, when risk is not prioritized at the lowest level of the organization, and there is weak MFA deployment across the environment, it's a recipe for disaster. On the more technical kind of like IT specific things, right? So those first two, those are very much like lived experiences of your average employee, right? They have to do their MFA prompt every day, and they should be trained monthly, if not quarterly. Those are going to affect the experience of everyday employees and vendors. And the bottom two are really in the realm of the IT teams and potentially your managed service provider. But we see often that there's weak patching and updating of software. The most modern versions are more often than not the most secure. And the rationale there really is an older, dated, insecure version of software just has more time in the wild for people to develop exploits. And over the last few years, with the advent of AI and more sophisticated tools, the longer something is in the wild, the quicker and easier it is for a bug to be exploited, for a vulnerability to be exploited. And we see that outdated versions are often not really the main event of a story, but unpatched systems in the environment often, maybe not a causation, but definitely a correlation with security events. And then last but not least, it's on the IT team and leadership to eliminate stale accounts, software, and data. We often see environments where everyone wants to keep emails and software and accounts on the what if. From a security perspective, we want to minimize the footprint as much as possible. We want the smallest attack surface possible. Stale accounts, again, outdated software that don't need to be patched, right? They're just kind of a cash cow sitting out there. Yes, they're producing some revenue or something for a line of business, but we're just not investing in them. Is often an easy means to attack. George, any thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, Matt, these aren't advanced controls, as you stated, right. but what we consistently see is they're not fully or at least consistently implemented across the environment. So there's gaps in enforcement, gaps in coverage, and gaps in visibility. And honestly, that's exactly what attackers look for. It's not that organizations are missing the basics. It's that those basics aren't aligned or validated in a way that actually reduces the risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Once the basics are in place, and the basics, like any good hygiene program, you can't shower once a month. You can't shower. You can't clean your kitchen once a year. Those are hygiene factors, right? They absolutely need to be done consistently so things don't pile up. Once we've built a really strong base layer of hygiene and we have really good hygiene practices, then we can move into what George and I will spend the rest of the hour talking about. So these are some themes that I want you to pay attention to. These will absolutely resonate throughout what George will describe as he thinks about assessing an environment for cybersecurity. As practitioners, we often want to test, the actual recovery. When all is said and done, when the proverbial substance hits the fan, we need to be able to recover, right? We can't present an attacker with our SOC 2 attestation. We can't say we did a NIST assessment last year. When all is said and done, we need to test our ability to recover, not just our ability to meet controls. We're not going to specifically get into business continuity planning and disaster recovery, but in general, cyber resilience means validating your recovery objectives and aligning them to your any business impact analyses that you do. What George is going to speak to is kind of a first step and runs parallel to the business impact side, right? So this is a presentation kind of by IT professionals for IT professionals, but ultimately, right, we're all in business because there's revenue coming in the door, and as IT professionals and security professionals, it's our job to protect that. As security and IT professionals, we often struggle sometimes communicating, why and how what we do is so important. So hopefully some of the things that you get out of today's presentation allows you to translate all the people, process, and technology changes into true business risk reduction. And then last but not least, if anything stands out as kind of there's still a lot of questions, who owns it within the organization? If you build out a RACI chart, you really don't know what person or role to put in that RACI chart. It's likely that you need to clarify ownership across your enterprise. Tone at the top and risk culture absolutely has to be owned at the executive level, but that doesn't mean that the executives are going to be doing all the work, right? So building out and clarifying the ownership is a critical part. If it's nobody's focus or it's everyone's focus, you're likely not going to have the same results as if you explicitly dedicate a individual or a vendor to a role in your security environment. George, any thoughts on that before we move on?
No, I absolutely agree. And with respect to resilience, when ownership isn't clearly defined, accountability isn't either, right? And that's where we see organizations struggle during an incident. Decisions slow down, responsibilities become unclear, and recovery takes longer than expected. And what looks like structured on paper often breaks down in practice. And really, that's exactly what we're trying to address, making sure resilience is not just assumed, but actually operationalized.
Right. And often we find we see this all the time, right? Where we don't know what we don't know yet, right? And the only way that you can know something is to analyze it, to identify it, right? To assess it. So hopefully what comes out of this is when there are ambiguous kind of lines of responsibility, it often just means that you haven't analyzed the situation well enough. And that could be a review, that could be a people audit, a process audit, a technology audit. It could also just be, a third party, a new set of eyes looking at an environment for the first time.
Yeah.
All right. So to reiterate something that George said earlier, which I think bears repeating, is organizations often are investing in the right technologies and they're hiring the right people, but sometimes it could just be sort of a process gap, and that's what we'll be talking about next. But we find that organizations, as they invest heavily in a digital transformation, a cloud migration, obviously the advent of AI and the use of it across the environment adds its own risks. But all of these very exciting changes typically outpace the security, the maturity of your security posture. So what we'll talk about next is the gaps that we find. They're typically unseen on a dashboard or in a security scorecard, whether it's proprietary or something based off NIST or Microsoft best practices. And it's those gaps that lead to issues, right? To say again from a previous slide, right? The SOC 2 certification, right, is kind of the standard for a lot of firms. It absolutely shows, right? It's a sign that you're moving in the right direction. That GRC is an important part of the environment, but it absolutely doesn't address every single security gap that an attacker can exploit.
Yeah. Yeah, and and what makes this even more challenging is that most organizations believe they have reasonable coverage until it's actually validated, right? On paper, the controls are there, the tools are in place, and the dashboards look good. But when you step back and look across identity, cloud, and endpoints together, that's where the gaps really start to show up.
Absolutely. All right.
So, so let's take a step back and look at what's happening at a broader level across digital transformation, AI, and cybersecurity. Because this is the environment all of us are operating in. First, on the digital transformation side, about 70% of digital transformation initiatives fail to meet their stated objectives. And so while organizations are investing heavily in modernization and cloud, large percentage are not achieving the outcomes that they expected. Now, if we look at AI, the expectations are just as high. Roughly 40 to 50% of organizations expect to see ROI from AI within the next 1 to 3 years. But at the same time, only about 4 to 6% of organizations would consider themselves truly mature in their AI capabilities. So what we have is a situation where expectations are very high, but actual maturity is still very low. So now let's bring that into cybersecurity and resilience. Only about 1/3 of organizations feel confident in their ability to manage cyber risk today. And when an incident does occur, the impact is significant, absolutely. The average cost of a breach is around $5 million now when you factor in downtime, recovery, and operational disruption. And on top of that, about 88% of cybersecurity incidents involve some form of human error, whether that's a misconfiguration, credential misuse, or social engineering even. So when you step back and you look at all of this together, what it tells us is this. We're increasing complexity much faster than we're increasing control. Organizations are investing in cloud, investing in AI, investing in security tools, but they're not always gaining that clear, validated understanding of their actual risk posture. And that gap between complexity and control is exactly where we tend to see the risks emerge. So if we
yeah, and the one stat in there that I think deserves extra attention is the cost, both explicit and implicit cost of an attack. We often find with clients going through an event that for very legitimate reasons, we might choose downtime, right? And just to use large round numbers, let's say a firm makes $365 million in revenue annually, right? So every day that they are offline is $1 million of revenue lost. The right choice may be to turn down servers, to turn down services, to to end business processes for the greater good, right? Kind of lose the battle to win the war situations. But that doesn't mean that when all is said and done and the financial statements are are published to the board, that doesn't mean that revenue won't take a hit, right? So the overused expression is it's not a matter of if, but when. I think that what we really strive to do is, instead of speak in in the binary, yes, you are covered, no, you are not, is really to shorten the time of the events so that those explicit and implicit costs are ultimately lower than they would have been otherwise. We, as a managed service provider, the vast majority of our clients are in the mid-market. Why is the mid-market such a target? Because it sits at this really tough epicenter of the things George mentioned, right? So there's digital transformation, there's AI adoption. So all these good things are happening at mid-market and even small, medium businesses, right? But so what that means is there's extremely valuable data, right? If they wouldn't be in business if their data wasn't extremely valuable, right? But at the same time, IT organizations are stretched or under-resourced. And what I mean by that is it could be a global mid-market company, but all IT works a particular shift, right? So it's not to say they don't have the skill. It's not to say they don't have the right technology in place, but they could be stretched very thin, right? They're overly reliant on heroics of a few really good professionals that keep the lights on. And because these mid-market firms aren't one of the Fortune 100, Fortune 500s that have market caps the size of small countries, right? A mid-market firm may be one or two material events away from ruin, right? And that's the sad side of cybersecurity, right? It's that a large firm might have a nest egg large enough to survive an event, a couple bad events, a couple of death by 1,000 paper cuts. The mid-market is both highly valuable as an asset class, and it's also unfortunately one of the more softer targets. So sadly, the mid-market is again right at that epicenter of being both a soft and a high value target. George.
So now when we step into real environments, this is what that gap actually looks like in practice. What we consistently see is not a lack of investment, but a lack of clarity. First, there's limited visibility into true security maturity. Organizations have dashboards and scores, but those don't necessarily reflect how well controls are actually working. I'd say second, there's an over-reliance on tools without enough context. The data's there, but it's not always translated into real risk or business impact. We also see identity misconfigurations creating hidden risk. Things like inconsistent MFA enforcement, excessive privileges, gaps in conditional access that aren't immediately obvious. On the cloud side, governance is often inconsistent. So controls that exist in one place, they're not applied the same way in another place. And then probably the biggest challenge I'd say is everything starts to feel like a priority, right? Organizations are dealing with hundreds of findings, recommendations, and alerts, but without that clear way to determine what actually matters, you end up in a much different place than you'd like to be.
Yeah. And that the clarity piece too, and clarity and prioritization kind of go hand in hand, right? That's the most critical point. So a vulnerability scan, a penetration test, a security assessment, there's anywhere from, I don't know, probably two to four buckets of vulnerabilities that we discover, right? There's the there's the low cost, high impact things, right? Hey, we didn't know this was exposed to the web. Hey, close this down, shut off this server. We don't use it anymore, right? It's like it's low input, very high output, right? Those are the easy things. The security professionals love seeing that, especially consultants, right? We would love to see those vulnerabilities because low hanging fruit. It's easy for everyone to understand. On the high end of cost, there's you need to make a material investment in new servers, in a new deployment. You need to completely rebuild your application because it's 10 plus years old, right? I think those are also pretty easy to understand. I think a lot of executives and boards are very IT literate these days. So they understand that an older, outdated thing is both expensive to fix, and it's also filled with risk, right? What's really challenging is those in between vulnerabilities, right? So they would be the ones that have a very high cost for a low impact, or it's a low cost, but it's also a very low impact, right? Those are the vulnerabilities, and those are the gaps that aren't sexy. They no one gets excited when we clean things up, right? But taken in aggregate, those are the risky areas of the environment that don't have clarity and would allow an attacker to move laterally throughout the environment, right? So just to kind of reiterate, right? There's the low hanging fruit, high impact, low cost stuff. There's the high impact, high cost stuff. Both of those are very easy to describe. It's the things in the middle, right? The lower impact stuff that require immense amount of clarity, and hopefully what George will move into will help with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, let me try to make this real for you. What you're looking at here is not a worst case scenario or an outlier. It's actually a very typical identity profile we see when we walk into Azure environments, especially in mid-sized organizations that have been investing in cloud monitored identity. On the left side, this is the starting point. We have an environment where MFA is technically in place, but it's not consistently enforced across all users. There are stale accounts still active, be they former employees, service accounts, or accounts that simply haven't been reviewed over time. Privilege access has expanded gradually, often based on operational need, but without being pulled back in. And then there's limited visibility into risky sign-ins, meaning the organization doesn't always know when something abnormal is happening. Now, if you were to ask that organization how they feel about their identity posture, most of them would say they're in a pretty good place. They have identity tooling, they have MFA, they have some level of monitoring, and from a surface, perspective, that feels like coverage. But this is where the problem really starts to emerge, right? Each of these gaps on its own don't feel critical. None of them immediately trigger alarm. But when you look at them collectively, when you step back and evaluate how identity is actually being used and enforced across the environment, that's where the risk becomes a little more clear. This becomes a very accessible attack surface. And this is exactly how modern attacks are happening today. We're not seeing attackers rely on complex exploits, not as often as we used to anyway. Instead, they're taking advantage of what's already there: credentials, access, and inconsistent enforcement. And so maybe just give you a quick example. We worked with an organization where MFA was deployed across most users, but not enforced for a very small group of executive accounts, likely out of convenience. One of those accounts had a password that had been reused elsewhere and was eventually compromised. The attacker didn't bypass anything. They didn't exploit anything. They simply logged into the environment. And once they were in, they didn't need to move laterally using advanced techniques. They simply used the access that already existed within that account. And see, that's the key shift we're seeing, especially in Azure and cloud-based identity platforms. Attackers don't break in, they log in. And this is why validation matters. Because when we actually assess environments, not just look at dashboards or scores, but validate how controls are functioning in practice, what we consistently find is that a significant proportion of those identities don't have enforced MFA. Privilege access is broader than intended. Dormant accounts are still active. And risk-based controls like conditional access are either incomplete or not fully aligned. And this is sort of where organizations get caught off guard. Because they look at their environments and say, we have MFA, we have identity, we have protection, we have monitoring, they assume they're covered, but coverage is not the same thing as protection. And what we're really doing through this assessment is shifting that perspective. And we're not just asking if controls exist, we're asking whether they are consistently enforced, aligned, and actually reducing risk. And it comes down to a very, very simple question. If someone gets into your environment today, what happens next? Do they have access they shouldn't have? Are there accounts that shouldn't exist? Is there visibility into what they're doing? Or does that activity just go unnoticed? And once we bring structure and governance into that environment, once we enforce MFA consistently, reduce that privilege, eliminate stale accounts, and implement proper visibility, everything really does start to shift. We move from partial coverage to full enforcement, privilege sprawl to least privilege, unknown exposure to clear visibility, and then really from delayed detection to near real-time awareness. And one of the most important points here, I think, is this: none of this requires new tools. This is not about adding more technology. This is about taking what already exists in that environment and making it consistent, enforced, and in line. And that's really what a defensible identity posture looks like. It's not perfect, but it's controlled, visible, and something that you can actually explain and stand behind. And then, okay, so once identity is exposed, the next question becomes, what can that access actually reach? And that's what we'll cover on the next slide.
Yeah, awesome. Misconfigurations.
Yes, so, now once access is gained, where we typically will see the next layer of risk come to be. What you're looking at here is a very common cloud configuration profile in Azure environments. And just like identity, it's not an outlier. This is what we consistently see in environments that have grown over time without a strong governance model. And on the left side, this is the starting point again. We have publicly exposed resources, things like storage accounts or services that were never intended to be accessible externally, but due to configuration drift or any number of other issues, they are now. We see overly permissive RBAC roles, access that is expanded based on operational need, but just hasn't been tightened up over time. In some cases, policies may exist, but they're not consistently enforced across all subscriptions. And logging and monitoring are often fragmented, meaning there isn't really a unified view of what's happening across the entire environment. And just like with identity, if you look at each one of these individually, they don't always feel urgent. A single exposed resource might not seem critical. A broad permission might feel necessary for operations. Missing policy might feel like something to address later. But when you combine these conditions with identity access, this becomes a very exploitable environment. And so this is where cloud environments behave very differently from traditional infrastructure. I think in the past, an attacker needed to break through layers of defense, obviously. Today, if they have valid access, they're often operating inside the environment almost immediately. let me give you sort of a practical example here. We've seen environments where a storage account was exposed publicly, not intentionally, obviously, but due to a configuration setting during deployment. It's one that somebody just missed. And on its own, that's a concern. But now combine that with identity access. An attacker logs in with a valid credential. They begin enumerating what they have access to. They identify resources that are exposed or permissions that allow broader access than expected. And now they don't need to break anything. They simply access what's already available. And that process happens very, very quickly, often in minutes, definitely not hours or days. Cloud doesn't create the risk, misconfiguration does. And when we validate these environments through the assessment, what we're consistently able to find is that there's multiple resources exposed that shouldn't be, permissions that are broader than intended, policies that are defined but never really fully enforced, and logging that is either incomplete or not centralized in a way that provides meaningful visibility. And just like with identity, these controls exist. They're not consistently applied though. And this is where cloud environments become challenging to manage over time. They usually grow quickly. Different teams deploy resources. Different projects create new subscriptions. And over time, what started as a well-structured environment begins to sort of diverge. And that divergence becomes drift. And that drift is where the risk accumulates. Because now you don't have a single consistent control plane. You have variations, you have exceptions, you have gaps between what was intended and what actually exists. And those gaps are exactly what attackers look for. So what we're doing in this phase of the assessment is identifying and eliminating that drift. We're bringing the environment back to a known, controlled, and consistent state. And when that happens, the impact is immediate. Public exposure is eliminated. Access becomes controlled and aligned to least privilege. Policy enforcement becomes consistent across every subscription. and logging becomes centralized and actionable. And just like we saw with identity, detection improves dramatically. What previously took days to identify can now be detected in near real time. And again, the key point here is this is not about adding new tools. This is about governance. And it's about making sure the controls that already exist in Azure and are applied consistently, enforced correctly, and aligned across the entire environment. And that's what a defensible cloud posture looks like. Not just having those controls in place, but having the confidence that those controls are working everywhere the way they should.
Absolutely. And two points there, George, is, AI is going to supercharge all of this, right? I may be over provisioned as a user and just not know it until someone, as the previous slide said, until an attacker just logs in as Matt. And the other point to really drive home here that George is saying is that this does not require drastic changes in technology spend, right? It does require a drastic increase in governance, though. And I can't think of any more board-ready, board of directors briefable slide as a CIO, as a CISO, as an IT director prepping the CFO to say that we have materially improved our security posture and the only spend was labor. The increase of, the efficacy of the security of the IT spend went way up, and it didn't require new tools. It didn't require expansions of licenses, et cetera, right? All we did was use what we had better. Truly can't think of a more briefable note in the IT world than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And from here, the next question becomes, someone has gotten into the environment.
Mhm.
What happens when they actually execute? And that's what we cover on the next slide.
Yep.
So now we get to the part of the conversation where most organizations probably feel fairly confident, and it's also the least validated. When we walk into an environment and talk about endpoint and ransomware readiness or recovery, what we typically hear is we're covered. We have backups, we have recovery plans, we've defined recovery time objectives, and we've invested in tools to support all of that. And on paper, that's usually true. But this is where we have to separate what exists from what actually works. And really, because recovery is not something you assume, it's something you prove. Having backups doesn't mean you can recover. And I'll be very direct here. Most organizations we work with have never actually tested their ability to recover from a full ransomware event. They've tested individual pieces of it. They've restored files. They've validated that backups exist, but they haven't tested recovery the way it would actually happen during an incident. They haven't tested what happens when identity is compromised, or tested how systems come back online in sequence. They haven't tested whether business operations can actually resume within timeframes leadership expects. And that's where the risk reality is. Because during an actual ransomware event, the challenge is not just restoring data, it's restoring the full business. And when we validate this through the assessment, what we typically find is that there has been no full recovery simulation. Identity systems like Entra ID or Active Directory are not included in the recovery planning. Backup processes haven't been tested under pressure, and recovery timelines are based on assumptions rather than real world validations. And what you end up with, obviously, is a gap. A gap between what the organization believes is going to happen and what would actually happen during the incident.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one of the key validations with this assessment is to go through these environments and find out what actually is validated versus what we think is validated.
Absolutely. And there's a cost benefit with all aspects of IT security. I think the point that we're really trying to drive home is, yes, to do, what we're not talking about here is prescribing you need a RTO or a RPO of X, right? We're not prescribing to have a hot site to completely be able to run in parallel, right? We're talking about optimizing what you're likely already paying for. And to quote George's illustrative example here, right? We assume right now that we could get back up and running in 24 hours, but it's only after assessment and testing that we can validate that it's 4 hours. Now, from an executive standpoint, this is where after the assessment, after the low-hanging fruit remediation, now we can, with confidence, go to the executive leadership team, to the board of directors, and say, hey, firing on all cylinders, we could get back up and running in 4 hours. Now it's a business decision. Now it's on the business to say 4 hours is not good enough. What do we need to do to make it 1 hour, to make it 1 minute? That becomes a business decision. That becomes a finance decision. IT and IT security and operations likely have done everything they can to protect the revenue and the profitability and the name brand of the firm. But the only way we're going to know that is if it's a mutual conversation between the business needs and the IT reality. Any thoughts there, George, before we move on?
No, just exactly right. And so the next slide we can show you how we go about assessing this. So, when you look across identity, cloud configurations, and resilience, what we consistently see is a pattern. Gaps obviously don't exist in isolation. They exist in how these areas connect. And I think that's what makes them difficult to identify and even harder to prioritize. And this is where we shift from observation to action. What we've built is a structured cloud security assessment designed to bring these three domains together: identity, cloud, and endpoint resilience, into a single validated view of risk. And obviously, the goal isn't just to generate more findings. It's to give you clarity, show you what's working, show you what's not, show you where you're exposed, and more importantly, what actually matters from a business perspective. Because until you have that level of visibility and alignment, it's very difficult to move from reacting to issues to actually governing your security posture with confidence. And that means we don't just tell you what's wrong, we tell you what actually matters to your business.
Awesome.
So this is a real world use case. And so hopefully what we do here is bring all this together with a real world example. Because I think this is where it starts to click. This was a mid-sized enterprise environment, very similar to what you guys are likely operating in today. And they had made all the right investments. They were in Azure, they had identity controls in place, they had endpoint protection, and they had backup and recovery processes. So from a tooling perspective, they were not behind at all. But they had the same challenges we've been talking about throughout this session. They didn't have a clear, validated understanding of their actual risk posture. And that showed up in a few very similar ways. On the identity side, MFA was deployed, not consistently enforced. There were privileged accounts that had more access than they needed, and there were still accounts that were still active in the environment. On the cloud side, obviously, there were configuration inconsistencies. Some resources were exposed that shouldn't have been, and policies were defined, but not enforced consistently across all subscriptions. And on the resilience side, they had backups, but they had never tested full recovery in a way that reflected a real ransomware scenario. So just like we discussed earlier, the controls were there, but they weren't aligned, validated, or consistently enforced. And that's where the assessment came in. And what we did was bring structure across those three domains: identity, cloud, endpoint, and resilience, and validated how controls were actually functioning in practice. Not just what was configured, although we looked very deeply into that, but what was effective. And what that gave us was a clear picture of where the real risks were. Not 100 findings, not a long list of recommendations, but a prioritized view of what actually mattered. And once we had that clarity, the remediation becomes very focused, right? We enforce MFA consistently across all identities. We reduced privilege access down to true least privilege. We eliminated those stale accounts. And on the cloud side, we removed public exposure, tightened RBAC, and enforced policy consistently across the environment. And then on the resilience side, we conducted a full recovery validation, making sure identity systems and business processes were all aligned. And the outcome was significant. Detection improved from days to near real time. Exposure was reduced across identity and cloud, and recovery moved from assumed to validated. But I think what was really just as important, leadership now had confidence, not just because they had more tools, but because they had that clarity. They understood where they were exposed, what had been addressed, and what still needed attention. And that's real value in this approach. It's not just about finding problems, it's about making those problems understandable.
And when we're thinking from a materiality standpoint, right, the cost of that clarity is immaterial, right? It's not a complete, totally destructive test, right? That delays the business. This is a a small scope with a high impact. Again, back to that illustrative example of a company making $365 million a year, right? Every day of downtime is $1 million of revenue that can never be recognized. And by no means is anything George proposing coming close to $1 million of spend, right? So we have this incredibly effective way of providing clarity at a completely immaterial cost.
Absolutely. All right. So I guess, as we wrap up, I just want to bring this back to what you should take away from today. Across everything we covered, identity, cloud configuration, endpoint resilience, the common theme is this: most organizations don't lack tools or investment. They lack a clear, validated understanding of how those controls are actually working together. And what you should walk away with is a different way of thinking about security posture, not just in terms of tools or scores or individual controls, but in terms of clarity. Do you have the visibility into where you're truly exposed? Do you understand which risks actually matter to the business? And can you confidently explain that to leadership?
Absolutely. All right. So in closing, I've gotten some questions in the chat that we'll speak to, and I wouldn't be a good consultant without a shameless plug. So for any of you interested in talking to me or George, feel free to reach out. You can work through Synoptek for this security assessment, and then we can personalize the assessment to fit your needs and your business's needs. George, before we get to any of the questions, any one-liner, anything to close out? What's the key takeaway for the audience?
You don't have to wait for an audit or a breach to understand your risk. And what we've shown today is that in a relatively short period of time, typically 3 to 5 weeks, you can move from uncertainty to a clear, defensible view of your security posture across identity, cloud, and endpoint resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you, George. So I am now looking at our questions. It looks like we have about 6 minutes or so. I'll read these and then George and I will answer them. But one of the ones we have right now is so we already have plenty of this is perfect made for us, right? So we already have tools. We use a security dashboard. How do we know if we're actually secure beyond that? George, you've mentioned it a few times.
Go ahead, Matt. I know you have this one for sure.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to dashboards are great. They're extremely briefable, right? But the gaps in the dashboard, right? There's what we aggregate and what we tell to executives and the board, and then there's also the conversations that need to happen between IT professionals. I'd go back to one of our earlier slides about what can be done today. It's removing stale accounts, removing stale data, right? Enforcing MFA and training your company and your vendors. That's when we have a 100% across those 4 basic areas. That's going to be telling that story that we have our essentials covered. It's ultimately going to tell a better story than the dashboard that gives us a given grade or score.
Yeah, I mean, tools like Microsoft Secure Score are helpful, but they reflect recommended configurations, not validated security posture. And in our assessment, we validate across Entra ID, Azure resources, endpoints to determine if controls are actually enforced and effective. Secure Score tells you what you should do. Our assessment shows you what's actually protecting you. And I think that's one of the clear differences.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's go. Moving to everything feels like a priority in security. How do we realistically decide what to fix first? Great question. I think it comes back to those, right? So think of your 2x2 quad chart, right? There are low cost, high impact. There's high cost, high impact. Then there's high cost, low impact, and low cost, low impact, right? I think that there's three very clear stories. There's everything that George has been talking about today. That is high impact, low cost stuff. That's the low hanging fruit, right? Those are, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily obvious, but once you do an assessment of your environment, either as, by yourself or with a third party like Synoptek, those are the non-negotiables, right? Low cost to fix, very high impact. The high impact, high cost stuff, not to say it's a priority, but it's a different type of priority, right? Everything that George said is optimization of what IT is already paying for. High cost, high impact stuff, that affects the whole company, right? That's going to affect operations. That's going to change the way sales does their business, and it's going to change the way HR conducts their business, right? Those are, that's not to say they're not important, but that's a different type of conversation. That's a budgetary conversation. The hardest thing that I have to say, it depends, right? Are those things in the middle, right? The low impact stuff in aggregate can still have a high impact, but those are kind of those, just binary decisions. Hey, do we completely remove, I don't know, Zoom, right? Instead of us updating Zoom all the time, do we just remove it? Do we just say people can't use Zoom anymore and they have to use Microsoft Teams or something, right? Those are like that's the not fun part, right? That's just like the pick and shovel work of like chipping away at your security posture. So to back to the main question, right? If everything does feel like a priority when it comes to security, it starts with clarity, right? As George and I have said quite a bit, and really bucketing those risks, those bugs, those vulnerabilities, those known exploits into those three buckets, right? What can we do in the next few weeks right now to improve our posture? On the other end of the spectrum, what needs to be a long-term budgetary conversation? And then what are things that we need to come up with, monthly or quarterly plans to chip away at? Any thoughts there, George, before our last question?
I agree. I mean, obviously, we prioritize based on likelihood, business impact, and exposure. An easy way to say it is a global admin without MFA is definitely critical. Some of the minor things with the secure score, not so much. And so, aside from aligning with known frameworks, NIST, zero trust, so on, it's really just making it the business impact, exposure, and likelihood that something could happen with it really drives how we push the prioritization.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So let's see. So I'll end on this note because it'll be a layup for me. But in your experience, what are the most common gaps companies think they've covered but actually haven't? MFA, absolutely. MFA. To George's earlier point from on that identity slide, I think that there is and I don't blame anyone for this mindset, but there's this logical opinion that we paid for X license with Microsoft, right? We went from E3 to E5, or we got P2, or whatever it is, right? There's this idea that we paid for a thing, therefore we have it, which is right for a lot of commerce. but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily optimized. So in our experience, the biggest gap is what firms are paying for when it comes to licensing on a per user per month basis versus are you getting the full value of it. Yeah, and we're right at time. George, any closing thoughts?
No, exactly that, and also is it configured correctly, right? So those are key. But
Yes.
no,
Yeah,
that's it.
yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, we are right at time. Thank you all so much for joining. We really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. And George and I are available for any follow-on conversation. Please reach out to us or your Synoptek rep. And yeah, look forward to future conversations. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.